Hello, Aquarius. This energy already feels very different, very quiet, very reflective, and honestly, somebody here cannot stop thinking about you. They're looking at this connection from a completely different perspective now, because for a long time, they convinced themselves they had more time to figure things out, more time to understand their feelings, more time before they had to say what was really in their heart. But something has shifted. Because your energy isn't reaching for them the way it used to. Your silence feels different. Your absence feels different. And wow, they're starting to realize how much of their emotional world was connected to you. This person is beginning to understand that what they felt wasn't something ordinary. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something about the way you challenged them, inspired them, and made them see themselves differently. And honestly, that realization is becoming harder to ignore. So the question is, why did it take distance for them to see your value more clearly? Why did they keep hiding behind logic when their heart was trying to tell them something else? Because this person has been carrying feelings they haven't fully expressed. They've been watching, thinking, remembering, and little by little, they're starting to understand that some connections don't disappear simply because they're left unspoken. Okay. Let's see what the cards want to reveal. Okay. The moment I see the Four of Swords, the first thing I'm feeling is that somebody is being forced to sit with their own thoughts. Not because they wanted to, not because they planned to, but because the noise between the two of you has disappeared. And wow, that silence is speaking much louder than words ever could. You know, I don't feel like Aquarius is chasing anymore. I don't feel that constant reaching. I don't feel that energy of trying to make someone understand. Instead, I see somebody turning inward, focusing on their own life, their own healing, their own path. And honestly, that shift is creating a reaction. Because there was a time when this person almost expected your energy to always be there, expected your attention, expected your understanding, expected your patience, not in a malicious way, more like they became comfortable with it, comfortable knowing that no matter how confusing things became, your presence remained. But something changed, and now they're noticing it. As I look deeper, the Hermit appears, and this card feels incredibly important, because while Aquarius has been finding peace in their own space, somebody else has been entering a period of reflection they didn't expect. They're looking back, looking inward, looking at conversations they once brushed aside, looking at moments they didn't fully appreciate when they were happening. And honestly, I think what surprises them most is realizing how much room you occupied inside their world, not because you demanded attention, not because you tried to control anything, but because your energy became part of their everyday life, part of their emotional landscape, part of their routine. And now they're noticing the empty spaces, the spaces where your voice used to be, the spaces where your presence used to exist, the spaces where they assumed there would always be another chance. Wow, this feels very emotional, because I don't actually feel panic here. I feel realization, the kind that arrives quietly, the kind that sneaks into someone's heart while they're driving somewhere, while they're scrolling through their phone, while they're sitting alone with their thoughts. And suddenly they remember you. Not because they were trying to, but because something reminds them of you. A phrase, a song, a place, a memory, and then they find themselves wondering what you're doing, how you're feeling, whether you've moved on emotionally, whether you're happier now, whether you're thinking about them at all, because the Page of Swords is showing up here. And this is where I start feeling that observation energy. Somebody's just paying attention. Maybe more than Aquarius realizes. They're curious, they're watching, they're checking, trying to gather little pieces of information, not necessarily because they're ready to talk yet, but because they feel disconnected from your world. And that disconnect bothers them, because they used to know what was happening in your life, or at least they felt connected to it. Now there are gaps, now there are questions, now there are things they don't know. And for someone who thought they had more time, that uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Honestly, I keep feeling this energy of them trying to understand what changed. Because from their perspective, Aquarius didn't create drama. Aquarius didn't make a scene. Aquarius didn't force anything. You simply became quieter, more focused on yourself, more invested in your own journey. And that's exactly why they're noticing. Because there's nothing to argue with, nothing to defend against, nothing to blame, only absence, only distance, only the realization that your energy isn't revolving around them anymore. And then we arrive at the Five of Pentacles. And wow, this card feels heavier than it looks. Because what I'm sensing here isn't physical distance, it's emotional distance. It's the feeling of looking towards something that once felt close and realizing it isn't as accessible as it used to be. And that feeling is affecting them more than they expected. They're beginning to understand what life feels like without the comfort of knowing you there, without the reassurance of your attention, without the certainty that you would continue waiting. You know, I think this person spent so much time assuming the connection would always be available that they never stopped to imagine what it would feel like if it wasn't. But now they are. And that's where this longing begins, not through dramatic declarations, not through sudden confessions, but through quiet moments, through missing things they never thought they would miss, through recognizing pieces of you hidden inside their daily life. And the more they notice those pieces, the harder it becomes to ignore how much they still think about you. Because what started as curiosity is slowly becoming something deeper, something they haven't fully admitted yet, something they're still trying to understand. And as they sit alone with these thoughts, I keep feeling them asking themselves a question they weren't prepared for. What if Aquarius is no longer waiting? Because the truth is, once somebody starts asking that question, they can never completely return to the version of themselves that didn't care about the answer. And that's where this energy begins to deepen. As I'm sitting with these cards, I keep feeling memories surfacing unexpectedly. Not dramatic memories, not the moments people usually talk about. It's the small things. The conversations that lasted longer than they planned. The random topics that somehow turned into hours of talking. The feeling of being understood without having to explain every little detail. And that's exactly where the Six of Cups starts showing itself. Because somebody here keeps drifting back toward those moments. Not because they're trying to live in the past. Honestly, I think they're trying to understand why those memories still feel so alive. Why they still carry weight. Why they still have the power to affect them. You know, there are some people who pass through our lives and leave pleasant memories. And then there are people who quietly change the way we think, the way we see ourselves, the way we experience the world. And that's what feels different here. Because when I look at the star, I don't feel this person remembering what Aquarius looked like. I feel them remembering what it felt like to talk to you. What it felt like when an idea suddenly made sense because of something you said. What it felt like when they shared something vulnerable and somehow felt safe doing it. What it felt like to be challenged without being judged. Wow! That's actually a very rare thing. And I think they're starting to realize how rare it was. Because life kept moving, responsibilities happened. Distractions happened, ego happened, fear happened. But despite all of that, your influence never completely disappeared. There are still thoughts they hear in your voice. There are still perspectives they learned from you. There are still situations where they catch themselves asking, what would Aquarius think about this? And honestly, that realization catches them off guard. Because they weren't expecting your presence to remain this long inside their mind. The Queen of Swords is standing very strongly here. And the energy around this card feels fascinating. Because this person doesn't see Aquarius as someone they can easily replace. They don't. No matter how much they may have tried to convince themselves otherwise. No matter how much time has passed, no matter how much distance exists. Because there was something about the way you communicated, the way you observed, the way you understood things. You challenged them intellectually, emotionally, even spiritually in some ways. And the more they reflect on that, the more difficult it becomes to compare you to anyone else. Okay, let me say this. I don't actually feel that they're only missing a relationship. I feel they're missing a connection. There's a difference. Relationships can be recreated. Connections like this feel much harder to find, and that's the realization that seems to be growing inside them. Because they've encountered other people, they've had other conversations, they've continued living their life. But something always feels slightly incomplete, like a missing piece they can't fully identify. And every time they start tracing that feeling back to its source, somehow it leads them back toward Aquarius, toward your energy, toward your words, toward your impact. The Knight of Cups appears, and suddenly the atmosphere softens. Because underneath all the thinking, underneath all the analysis, underneath all the attempts to stay rational, there are emotions here. Very real emotions. Emotions this person hasn't always known how to express. And that's important. Because I don't feel like they're struggling to understand whether they care. I think they're struggling with how much they care. That's a completely different experience. You know, it's easier to dismiss feelings when they're small. It's easier to walk away when somebody doesn't truly matter. But when someone leaves a lasting imprint on your heart, silence becomes louder, memories become stronger, and time doesn't always create the distance people expect. Honestly, the longer they sit with their thoughts, the more they begin recognizing that their pride isn't giving them the comfort they thought it would. Their defenses aren't bringing peace. Their stubbornness isn't making the connection disappear. If anything, it's creating more questions, more reflection, more longing. And that's why I keep feeling this gentle shift happening inside them. Not a dramatic awakening, not a sudden emotional explosion, just a quiet realization growing stronger every day. A realization that Aquarius brought something into their life that still matters. Something they haven't forgotten. Something they may never have fully appreciated while it was right in front of them. And the more that realization settles into their heart, the harder it becomes to pretend those feelings are simply memories. Because they're starting to feel like something much more present than that. Because once feelings stop living in the past and start feeling present again, that's usually when things become complicated. The energy shifts the moment I see the Nine of Swords. And honestly, this doesn't feel comfortable at all. Because somebody here is carrying thoughts they haven't shared with anyone. Thoughts that seem manageable during the day. Thoughts they can push aside while they're working, staying busy, talking to people, handling responsibilities. But when everything becomes quiet, those thoughts return. And they return with questions. Questions they don't necessarily have answers for. Questions about timing. Questions about choices. Questions about whether they misunderstood this connection from the very beginning. You know, I don't actually feel that this person is afraid of Aquarius. I think they're afraid of what Aquarius makes them feel. That's very different. Because some connections allow people to remain exactly as they are. This one doesn't seem to do that. This connection asks them to be honest. It asks them to be vulnerable. It asks them to acknowledge parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. And wow, that's where things become difficult. Because the moment somebody starts recognizing their truth, they also have to recognize every moment they ignored it. The moon is sitting right beside this energy. And I keep feeling somebody wandering through their own emotional landscape without a map, trying to understand what is intuition, what is fear, what is longing, what is imagination. Because there are moments when they think they should let everything go. Moments when they tell themselves enough time has passed. Moments when they convince themselves they're moving forward. And yet, something keeps pulling their attention back, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly, almost like an unfinished thought, a conversation that never fully ended, a feeling that never completely disappeared. And that's why I keep hearing this inner conflict. One voice saying, leave it alone, and another voice asking, but what if it still matters? Okay, this feels important. Because when the Seven of Swords appears, I don't immediately feel deception toward Aquarius. I feel avoidance toward themselves. I feel somebody carefully managing their emotions, choosing which feelings to acknowledge, choosing which feelings to hide, trying to stay in control of what is happening inside their heart. And honestly, they're getting tired. Tired of pretending certain emotions aren't there. Tired of acting unaffected, tired of always being the rational one. Because logic has carried them very far in life. Logic helped them make decisions. Logic helped them survive difficult situations. Logic helped them protect themselves. But logic isn't answering the questions they have about Aquarius. And that frustration is growing. Because every solution they normally rely on seems ineffective here. They can't think their way out of missing someone. They can't analyze their way out of longing. They can't organize their emotions into neat little boxes. And for somebody who likes certainty, that uncertainty feels overwhelming. The Two of Swords appears and suddenly everything becomes very still, very quiet, very internal. Almost like standing in front of a doorway and knowing a choice exists, but not feeling ready to walk through it. Honestly, I think this person has spent a long time standing in that doorway, looking in one direction, then the other, moving forward a little, pulling back again, wanting clarity, wanting certainty, wanting guarantees. But emotions rarely work that way, especially the deeper they become. And that's what feels different now. The emotions don't seem temporary anymore. They don't seem like something that will simply disappear if ignored long enough. They're becoming harder to dismiss, harder to rationalize, harder to explain away. You know, I keep seeing someone replaying conversations in their mind, not because they're stuck, but because they're searching. Searching for the moment they missed something important. Searching for the moment they should have listened more carefully. Searching for the moment they should have spoken more honestly. Because part of them is beginning to wonder whether fear has been making decisions that their heart never agreed with. Wow, that feels heavy. Because once that realization starts forming, it changes everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but quietly. The way a crack slowly appears in a wall that seemed solid for years. And what I'm sensing here is that the wall isn't between Aquarius and this person. The wall exists inside this person, between what they feel and what they've allowed themselves to admit, between what they want and what they're afraid could happen if they reach for it. And the distance between those two realities is becoming harder for them to live with, because every time they try to move away from these feelings, something inside them seems to circle back and ask the same question all over again. What if the thing they're most afraid of facing is also the thing they most want to understand? Because the longer somebody stands between fear and truth, the harder it becomes to ignore which one is actually asking to be heard. The energy changes the moment judgment appears, and wow, this doesn't feel like a dramatic revelation. It feels quieter than that, more personal, more intimate. Almost like somebody sitting alone and suddenly realizing they've been looking at the same story through the wrong lens for a very long time. You know, there are moments in life when people don't need new information. They need a new perspective. And that's exactly what I'm feeling here. Because this person keeps revisiting certain memories, certain choices, certain conversations, but they're not seeing them the way they used to. Something has shifted. The emotional distance created room for reflection. The silence created room for awareness. And now they're beginning to recognize things they couldn't fully see before. Not because Aquarius changed their mind for them. Not because somebody convinced them, but because they're finally listening to themselves, honestly. That can be one of the most uncomfortable experiences in the world. Because once someone starts being honest with themselves, they also begin recognizing where they avoided honesty in the past. And that's where the Ace of Swords enters this energy. The atmosphere becomes clearer, not necessarily easier, just clearer. I keep seeing somebody reaching a point where excuses don't feel as convincing anymore. The stories they once told themselves aren't working the way they used to. The emotional walls aren't creating the protection they thought they would. And there is this growing awareness that some of the obstacles they blamed on circumstances may have been connected to fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, fear of change, fear of caring more than they intended to. Okay, let's talk about that for a moment, because I don't think this person is looking back and saying they handled everything perfectly. Actually, it feels quite the opposite. I think they're beginning to notice moments where they pulled away when they wanted to move closer. Moments where they stayed silent when they wanted to speak. Moments where pride was louder than honesty. And that's not an easy thing to sit with, especially when someone starts wondering how different things might have felt if they had trusted themselves more. The Death card appears, and immediately I feel an ending. But not the ending of the connection. It feels more like the ending of an old version of themselves. The version that automatically ran from uncomfortable emotions. The version that believed distance could solve everything. The version that kept trying to maintain control over situations that required vulnerability instead. And honestly, growth rarely feels graceful when it's happening. Sometimes it feels confusing. Sometimes it feels painful. Sometimes it feels like pieces of an identity falling away before the new version has fully formed. That's what this energy reminds me of, because this person is standing between who they used to be and who they're becoming. And those two versions don't fully agree with each other. One still wants certainty. One still wants guarantees. One still wants protection. The other is starting to realize that meaningful connections often require courage. And that realization seems to be changing something fundamental inside them. Wow. Temperance feels incredibly important here, because after all this internal movement, all this reflection, all this emotional tension, I suddenly feel a desire for balance. Not perfection, not fantasy, just balance. A healthier understanding of love, a healthier understanding of partnership, a healthier understanding of what it means to truly share life with another person. You know, I think this person once viewed connection through the lens of fear. What could go wrong? What could be lost? What could become complicated? But now there seems to be another question emerging. What could happen if they stopped assuming the worst? What could happen if they allowed themselves to trust their own feelings? What could happen if they stopped treating vulnerability like an enemy? Because something inside them is slowly shifting away from resistance. Not completely, not all at once, but enough for them to begin seeing possibilities where they once only saw risks. And that's why this feels like an awakening rather than a decision. An awakening doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives, quietly changing the way somebody understands themselves, changing the way they understand another person, changing the way they understand the journey they've been on. And as all these pieces begin settling into place, I keep sensing this person standing in front of a truth that feels increasingly difficult to avoid. Not because anyone is forcing them to face it, but because their own heart keeps bringing them back to it. Again and again, until eventually they may have no choice but to ask themselves what they're going to do with everything they've finally begun to understand. Because understanding something and acting on that understanding are two very different things. And honestly, that's where the energy feels very interesting, because I don't feel somebody rushing anymore. I don't feel panic. I don't feel impulsiveness. What I feel is somebody becoming more intentional, more aware, more willing to look at their own life honestly. The moment Eight of Pentacles appears, I immediately sense effort. Not performative effort. Not effort designed to impress other people. Real effort. The kind nobody sees, the kind that happens behind closed doors, the kind that requires consistency. Because this person seems to be reaching a point where they recognize that wanting something and being ready for it are not always the same thing. And wow, that realization feels surprisingly mature, because there was a period where they may have focused almost entirely on what was missing, what felt difficult, what felt uncertain. But now I keep sensing somebody asking a different question. What needs to change inside me? And honestly, that's a powerful question, because it shifts the focus away from blame, away from excuses, away from circumstances, and toward personal responsibility. I keep seeing someone trying to organize parts of their life that previously felt chaotic. Not because they're trying to become perfect, but because they want to feel more stable within themselves, more grounded, more capable of showing up consistently. You know, some people spend years believing they need the right relationship to feel complete. This energy feels different. It feels like somebody realizing they need to become more complete within themselves first. And that's where the King of Pentacles enters. The atmosphere becomes steadier, calmer, less reactive. I keep sensing this person imagining a future in a way they didn't before. Not a fantasy, not an escape, a future, something real, something sustainable, something that could actually exist outside of imagination. And when they think about stability, when they think about trust, when they think about building something meaningful, Aquarius keeps appearing in those thoughts. Not because they're forcing the memory, not because they're trying to romanticize the past, but because your energy seems connected to qualities they value more now than they once did. Things like honesty, consistency, authenticity, emotional intelligence. The kind of qualities people sometimes overlook until life teaches them why those qualities matter. Okay, there's something else here, because I keep feeling this person looking at old obstacles differently. Situations that once felt impossible now seem more manageable. Challenges that once felt overwhelming no longer carry the same weight. And I think part of that comes from growth. Part of it comes from experience. Part of it comes from finally understanding what is truly important. The Chariot appears, and suddenly I feel movement. Not necessarily physical movement, internal movement. The kind that happens when somebody stops running from a decision. Because for a long time, I think this person lived in a state of hesitation. 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, moving towards something, pulling away again, repeating the cycle, trying to protect themselves while simultaneously wanting more. But that pattern seems harder to maintain now, because awareness changes everything. Once somebody sees their own behavior clearly, it's difficult to keep pretending they don't. And honestly, I think this person is becoming tired of their own avoidance, tired of circling around the same emotions, tired of carrying unfinished feelings, tired of wondering what could have happened if they had been braver. Wow, that feels significant, because courage doesn't always arrive as confidence. Sometimes courage arrives as honesty. Sometimes courage arrives as accountability. Sometimes courage arrives as somebody deciding they no longer want fear making every important decision. And that's exactly what I'm feeling. The Lovers appears and the entire energy softens, not in a dramatic way, in a sincere way, a human way, because underneath all the reflection, all the growth, all the self-examination, there is still affection here. There is still care here. There is still an emotional bond that seems difficult for them to dismiss. You know, I don't think Aquarius represents perfection in their eyes. I think Aquarius represents significance. And those are two very different things. Perfection is an illusion. Significance is something people carry with them. It's the impact someone leaves behind, the way they change a person's perspective, the way they influence growth, the way they remain present even during long periods of absence. And that's what feels so important here. Because this person is beginning to recognize that some connections are valuable, not because they're easy, but because they reveal parts of ourselves we may never have discovered otherwise. And the more they continue evolving, the more they continue creating stability inside their own life, the more they seem to wonder whether growth was only one part of the journey. Because another question has quietly started forming in the background. If they have changed this much already, What would happen if they eventually allowed Aquarius to see who they are becoming? Because at some point, growth stops being only about understanding yourself. It starts becoming about what you're willing to do with that understanding. And wow, that's exactly where this energy seems to be moving. The moment the Eight of Wands appears, everything feels lighter. Not because all the questions have disappeared, not because every fear has been resolved, but because something that felt stuck for a very long time is beginning to move. You know? I keep seeing somebody staring at a screen, picking up their phone, putting it back down, thinking about what they would say, thinking about what they shouldn't say, rewriting conversations in their mind before they've even happened. And honestly, that nervous energy feels very real, because this isn't just about communication. It's about vulnerability. It's about allowing another person to hear thoughts that have been living privately inside their heart for a very long time. I think this person has spent so much energy trying to understand themselves that they're beginning to realize another challenge exists, being understood by someone else. And for some reason, that feels even scarier. Because when emotions stay hidden, they remain protected, untouched, safe. But once they are spoken aloud, everything changes. That's why the Page of Cups feels so meaningful here. The energy softens immediately. I don't feel grand speeches. I don't feel dramatic declarations. I feel sincerity. The kind that often struggles to find the perfect words. The kind that worries about saying too much, or not saying enough. The kind that simply wants to be genuine, because honestly, I think this person has reached a point where pretending feels heavier than honesty, not easier. Heavier, and that changes the way they look at communication, because they aren't only thinking about what Aquarius might say. They're thinking about what they need to say, what they've wanted to explain, what they've wanted to acknowledge, what they've wanted to apologize for. Not because they believe explanations erase everything, but because some truths feel important enough to finally be spoken. Wow, there's a tenderness here that wasn't present before. Almost like somebody lowering their defenses little by little, allowing themselves to care openly instead of secretly, allowing themselves to feel without immediately analyzing every emotion. And that's where the Two of Cups creates such a beautiful shift, because suddenly the focus moves away from fear, away from mistakes, away from distance, and toward connection, toward understanding, toward the possibility of two people actually hearing one another. You know, I keep feeling this person realizing something very simple, yet very profound. Connection isn't created by perfection. It's created by presence. It's created by honesty. It's created by two people choosing to meet each other where they are, instead of where they wish they were. And that realization seems to be changing the way they view this entire situation. Because for a long time, they may have believed they needed all the answers first, all the certainty, all the confidence, all the guarantees. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes meaningful conversations happen while people are still figuring things out. Sometimes healing begins in the middle of uncertainty. Sometimes understanding grows through the conversation itself. Okay, the Six of Pentacles appears and the energy becomes incredibly balanced. Not perfectly balanced, humanly balanced, and honestly, that's even more beautiful. Because I keep sensing somebody recognizing the importance of reciprocity, of mutual effort, of emotional responsibility, of showing up differently than they once did. Not because they're trying to earn love, not because they're trying to prove something, but because they finally understand that meaningful relationships require participation from both sides. And wow, that awareness feels earned. It feels mature. It feels like the result of everything they've been learning internally. Because the person who once hesitated seems to be seeing things differently now. The person who once withdrew seems to be questioning whether distance truly gave them what they wanted. The person who once stayed silent seems increasingly aware of everything that silence never managed to express. And honestly, I think that's why this energy feels so emotional. Not because of what is happening externally, but because of what is happening internally. Something inside them is becoming ready. Ready to be more honest. Ready to be more open. Ready to stop carrying certain feelings alone. Ready to acknowledge the significance of what they've experienced. And as I sit with these cards, I keep feeling this image of someone pausing for a moment before crossing an invisible threshold. Not fully knowing how the conversation might unfold. Not fully knowing what the future holds, but beginning to understand that some connections continue asking for attention until they are finally met with honesty. And that realization seems to be lingering in their heart, growing quieter, yet somehow becoming impossible to ignore. And honestly, I think that's what this entire reading has been about. Not just missing someone, not just remembering someone, but understanding the impact a connection can have on our lives long after silence has settled in. Sometimes distance creates clarity. Sometimes reflection changes perspective. And sometimes the conversations we avoid become the very conversations our heart keeps returning to. Whatever part of this message resonated with you, take what feels right for your journey and leave the rest. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly appreciate your energy, your presence, and the space we've shared together here. And remember, the most meaningful answers don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they reveal themselves one realization at a time, until everything begins to make a little more sense. Take good care of yourself. Keep protecting your peace. Keep choosing yourself. And I'll see you next reading. Bye, Aquarius.